At dinner I said, just tell me when the reunion is. My wife's brother shot back, you're not part of the family. Don't show up. The table erupted in laughter. I just left. For days later, their loan payment failed. That night, my phone. You ever have one of those moments where you're physically present, but your soul has already left the building and is halfway to Taco Bell? Yeah, that was me on a Sunday night, sitting at my wife's parents' dining table like some kind of domesticated prop in their little suburban theater production. I had my homemade lasagna sitting in front of me. The same lasagna I'd spent 3 hours making because apparently store-bought wasn't good enough for the Parker family standards. The irony? Nobody had touched a single bite of it. They were too busy devouring the catered Italian spread that probably cost more than my car payment. But hey, at least I tried, right? My wife Melissa was practically glowing under the chandelier light, basking in her mother's approval like a sunflower that finally found the right angle. She was wearing that cream-colored dress her mom bought her last Christmas, the one with the price tag I accidentally saw and immediately regretted knowing about. Every time her mother said something, Melissa would nod enthusiastically, laugh at the exact right moment, and touch her arm like they were filming a Hallmark movie. It was the kind of performance that deserved an Oscar, or at least a participation trophy. Across from me sat Derek, Melissa's older brother and the family's golden child, despite being about as golden as a participation medal from a rigged carnival game. He was going on and on about his booming business, some tech startup thing that involved a lot of buzzwords like synergy and disruption, but very little actual profit. I knew this because I'd secretly bailed his ass out twice in the past year. Once when his investors pulled out faster than a dad leaving for cigarettes, and again when his revolutionary app turned out to be just another scheduling platform that nobody asked for. But sure, Derek, tell everyone about your empire. I'll just sit here and smile like the ATM I apparently am. His dad, my father-in-law Gerald, was scrolling through his phone with the focus of a surgeon, occasionally grunting in response to whatever his wife was saying. He had that CEO energy, the kind where he could be at a family dinner but still make you feel like you were interrupting a board meeting. Every few minutes he'd adjust his Rolex, which I'm pretty sure was less about checking the time and more about reminding everyone he had won. Real subtle, Gerald. Real subtle. Then there was Patricia, Melissa's mom, sitting at the head of the table with a smile so practiced it could have been trademarked. It was the kind of smile politicians wear right before they tell you they're raising your taxes for your own good. She kept complimenting the catered food, asking everyone if they wanted more wine, and occasionally glancing at me like I was a piece of furniture she was considering replacing. Every time she looked my way, I could practically hear her thinking, is this really the best Melissa could do? The conversation flowed around me like I was a rock in a stream, present but irrelevant. They talked about the upcoming family reunion in the Hamptons, some charity gala Gerald was hosting, and Derek's latest business victory, which I'm 90% sure was just him finally figuring out how to use Excel. I sat there, fork in hand, wondering if anyone would notice if I just started eating my lasagna and ignored the rest of the evening. Probably not. That's when I saw my opening. There was a brief pause in the conversation, one of those rare moments where everyone stopped talking at the same time to take a breath or a sip of wine. I figured, why not try to participate? Show them I was actually paying attention? So I leaned back in my chair, kept my tone light and casual, and said, just tell me when the reunion is. I'll book early this time. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The entire room went silent. Forks literally froze midair like someone had hit pause on reality. Melissa's eyes went wide. Patricia's smile faltered for half a second before snapping back into place. And Gerald actually looked up from his phone, which I'm pretty sure was a first. Derek, though? Derek leaned back in his chair with this smirk that made me want to punch his perfectly whitened teeth, and he delivered the line that would replay in my head for weeks. You're not part of the family. Don't show up. And then the table erupted. Not in shock, not in defense of me. No, they laughed. Patricia did that thing where she covered her mouth with her napkin like it was scandalous but hilarious. Gerald chuckled and went back to his phone. Derek was practically wheezing, looking around the table for validation like a comedian who just nailed his punchline. And Melissa? My wife, the woman I'd been married to for 5 years, the person who was supposed to have my back? She tried to hide her giggle behind her wine glass, but I saw it. I saw the corners of her mouth turn up, saw her shoulders shake slightly. She thought it was funny. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, processing what had just happened. This was my wife's family, the people I'd spent holidays with, loaned money to, made lasagna for, and they were laughing at me being publicly excluded from their little country club circle. The sheer audacity of it all was almost impressive. Almost. But here's the thing about being humiliated in front of people who think they're better than you. It gives you clarity. Suddenly, everything made sense. The subtle digs about my job, the jokes about my car, the way they always seemed surprised when I knew what wine to order. It all clicked into place. I wasn't family to them. I was an accessory, a plus one they tolerated because their daughter happened to marry down. So I did what any self-respecting person would do in that situation. I smiled. Not a fake smile like Patricia's, but a real one, the kind that comes from finally understanding the joke. I stood up slowly, adjusted my tie like I was getting ready for a photo shoot, and looked Derek right in his smug face. The table went quiet again, waiting to see what I'd do. Would I get angry? Storm off? Cause a scene? Instead, I said, no problem. I'll stay home and watch Family Feud. You guys seem to be starring in the live version. The silence that followed was chef's kiss perfect. Patricia's mouth opened slightly, Gerald's finger paused mid-scroll, and Derek's smirk evaporated faster than my respect for this family. Melissa looked like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Good. Let her marinate in that awkwardness. I grabbed my jacket from the back of my chair, picked up my untouched lasagna, and walked toward the door. Nobody stopped me. Nobody apologized. Nobody said a damn word. As I reached the front entrance, I heard Patricia whisper loudly, "Well, that was dramatic," followed by more uncomfortable laughter. I walked out into the cool night air, got into my car, and sat there for a moment with my lasagna on the passenger seat. Then I started laughing, really laughing, because I'd just walked out on dessert, and somehow, that felt like the best decision I'd made all year. Back home, I sat at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought from IKEA, and assembled myself because apparently hiring someone to do it was wasteful spending, according to Melissa, with my leftover lasagna sitting in front of me like a consolation prize. The apartment was quiet in that heavy way that makes you notice things you normally don't, like the hum of the refrigerator or the upstairs neighbor's inexplicably loud footsteps at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. I popped open the aluminum foil covering my masterpiece, grabbed a fork, and took a bite. And you know what? It was damn good. Better than good. It was phenomenal. The sauce had the perfect balance of sweet and savory. The cheese was melted to perfection, and the pasta was cooked just right. Not too soft, not too firm. This lasagna deserved a standing ovation, a parade, maybe even its own cooking show. What it definitely didn't deserve was to sit untouched on that pretentious dining table while everyone scarfed down overpriced catered garbage. I took another bite and thought, this lasagna deserves better company than them. And honestly, so did I. I half expected my phone to buzz within the hour. Maybe a text from Melissa saying, "Hey, that was awkward. Sorry about Derek being a complete tool." Or perhaps Patricia would call with one of her practiced apologies that somehow made you feel like you were the one who needed to apologize. Hell, I would have even settled for Gerald sending a thumbs-up emoji or something equally low effort. But no, nothing. Radio silence. My phone sat on the table next to my plate, dark and judgment-free, which was more than I could say for the people I'd just walked out on. By the time I finished my second helping of lasagna, because why not? I made it for 8 people and now it was all mine. I realized that the silence wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. For the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't worried about saying the wrong thing or wearing the wrong clothes or being enough for people who would never think I was enough anyway. I was just sitting in my apartment, eating incredible lasagna and existing without an audience. It felt like that first deep breath you take after being underwater for too long. Day 2 rolled around, and still nothing. I went to work, came home, heated up more lasagna for dinner. I was really getting my money's worth out of this thing, and waited. Part of me wondered if maybe they were holding some kind of emergency family meeting about me. I could picture them all sitting in Gerald's home office with its mahogany desk and leather chairs, discussing the situation like I was a quarterly earnings report that came in under projection. Patricia would be wringing her hands dramatically. Melissa would be defending me half-heartedly while secretly agreeing with everyone else. And Derek would be mansplaining why my reaction was completely uncalled for. Yeah, I could see it clear as day. But still, no calls, no texts, no carrier pigeon with an apology note tied to its leg. Nothing. By day 3, I started wondering if maybe they were holding auditions for a new son-in-law. I imagined them posting on LinkedIn, seeking son-in-law replacement. Must have six-figure income, Ivy League degree, complete lack of spine, and willingness to laugh at jokes at own expense. Previous experience being a human doormat preferred but not required. Derek's approval mandatory. Hell, they'd probably get hundreds of applicants. There's no shortage of people willing to marry into money and put up with casual humiliation if the benefits package is good enough. I spent that evening organizing my home office, which was really just a corner of the living room with a desk and a questionable office chair I'd found on sale, and stumbled across my old bank statements. I'd been meaning to go through them for months, but kept putting it off because who actually enjoys looking at where all their money went? Spoiler alert, it went to the Parker family black hole. As I flipped through the statements, I started seeing a pattern that I'd somehow missed while living it. Transfers to Derek. Transfers to cover family emergencies. Transfers for temporary loans that were about as temporary as a tattoo. It was like watching a horror movie where you want to scream at the protagonist, "Don't go in there, you idiot." Except I was the idiot and the scary basement was my bank account. Then day 4 came around, and with it, the moment I'd been unconsciously waiting for. My phone buzzed during my lunch break. I was eating a sad desk salad because I'd finally run out of lasagna that morning, and I saw Derek's name pop up on the screen. My heart did this weird jumpy thing, half excitement that someone finally reached out and half dread because I knew it wasn't going to be an apology. I was right on the money with that second feeling. His message read, "Hey, weird question. Did your bank block the transfer? The loan payment didn't go through." I stared at my phone for a solid 30 seconds, reading and rereading those two sentences, waiting for the punchline or the "just kidding" or literally anything that would indicate he understood what had happened at dinner. But nope, no mention of the public humiliation. No acknowledgement that his entire family had laughed at me being excluded. No, sorry my comment was harsh. Or maybe I went too far. Just straight to business. Straight to my wallet. Because that's all I'd ever been to them. A convenient ATM that occasionally showed up to family dinners. The audacity was actually impressive in a sick, twisted way. This man had told me I wasn't part of the family, watched everyone laugh about it, and now, just 4 days later, was casually hitting me up for money like we were buddies. Like nothing had happened. Like I was supposed to just shrug it off, wire him some cash, and wait for the next public roasting at the next family gathering. I sat there in my cubicle, surrounded by the beige walls and fluorescent lighting that suddenly felt more welcoming than any Parker family dinner, and typed out my response. I deleted it, typed it again, deleted it. Went through about 6 different versions ranging from a lengthy explanation of why he could go screw himself to a simple no. But then I landed on the perfect response, the one that said everything that needed to be said in just 10 words. Not part of the family. Not funding the family. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and immediately felt this wave of satisfaction wash over me. It was like that feeling you get when you finally cancel a subscription service you forgot you had. Pure relief mixed with a little bit of, why didn't I do this sooner? Then I did something I'd been wanting to do for years, but never had the guts to actually follow through with. I blocked him. Just straight up blocked his number. And you know what? It felt amazing. Liberating. Like I'd just dropped 50 pounds of dead weight I'd been carrying around without realizing how heavy it was. I finished my sad desk salad, went back to work, and spent the rest of the afternoon in the best mood I'd been in for months. When I got home that evening, I made myself a fresh pot of coffee. The good stuff, not the cheap grocery store brand I usually bought to save money for family emergencies, and sat on my couch with my favorite mug. I leaned back, put my feet up on the coffee table that Melissa always yelled at me for using as a footrest, and raised my mug to the ceiling in a solo toast. Here's to financial freedom and emotional bankruptcy. On their end, I said out loud to my empty apartment. And then I laughed. Really laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from deep in your chest and makes your eyes water a little bit. Because for the first time in my marriage, I'd chosen myself over keeping the peace. And damn, it felt good. By evening, I was deep into a documentary about ocean life. Because apparently my life had become so drama-free that I was genuinely interested in learning about jellyfish migration patterns. when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of someone pounding on my door like they were the police executing a warrant for a serial killer. The knocking was aggressive, demanding, the kind that says, "We're not going away," before you even look through the peephole. My first thought was that maybe I'd forgotten to pay some bill, and the collectors had finally found me. My second thought was that collectors usually don't show up at 7:30 on a weeknight because they have better things to do, like ruin people's mornings instead. I muted the TV, right in the middle of learning about bioluminescence, which was actually fascinating, and walked to the door with my coffee mug still in hand. Through the peephole, I saw exactly what I'd been half expecting and fully dreading. Gerald, my father-in-law, standing there in his business casual outfit like he'd just come from closing a merger deal, and Derek pacing beside him like a malfunctioning rooster who'd forgotten how to crow properly. Derek kept running his hands through his hair, checking his phone, looking at the door, then back at his phone. Gerald, meanwhile, stood perfectly still with his arms crossed, radiating that "I'm important and you're wasting my time" energy that rich people seem to emit naturally. I didn't open the door. I just stood there on my side, sipping my coffee and watching them through the tiny glass circle like they were animals at the zoo. There was something deeply satisfying about having a barrier between us, about being able to observe them without having to perform or pretend or be anything other than a guy enjoying his evening beverage. They banged harder. Gerald's voice came through the door, measured and authoritative. "We know you're in there. We just need to talk." "Yeah, I bet you do," I thought. "I bet you need to talk about that transfer that didn't go through. I bet you need to talk about how inconvenient it is that your personal ATM suddenly grew a spine and a block button." The thing is, "we need to talk" is always code for "we need something from you," and I was fresh out of things to give. Derek joined in, his voice higher and more desperate. "Come on, man, don't be like this. Just open the door for 5 minutes. 5 minutes. That's all they thought this would take. 5 minutes to smooth things over, manipulate me back into compliance, and get access to my bank account again. 5 minutes to explain why I was being too sensitive about being publicly humiliated and why family helps family, even when that family explicitly tells you you're not part of it. The math wasn't mathing, as the kids say, and I wasn't about to help them balance that equation. I took another sip of my coffee. It was getting cold, but I didn't care, and continued my little peephole surveillance operation. Derek was now doing this weird, anxious dance, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a kid who needed to use the bathroom. Gerald pulled out his phone, probably texting Melissa or Patricia to complain about my lack of cooperation. After about 2 minutes of this, which I'm sure felt like an eternity to them, Derek banged on the door again, even louder this time. "We're not leaving until you open this door," he shouted, which was honestly hilarious because they absolutely were going to leave. Nobody commits to standing in an apartment hallway forever, especially not people who consider waiting in line at Starbucks to be beneath them. I heard Gerald say something to Derek in a low voice, probably telling him to calm down or shut up or both. Derek responded with something I couldn't quite make out, but his body language suggested it was an agreement. They were starting to turn on each other, which was honestly better entertainment than the jellyfish documentary. I briefly considered making popcorn, but decided that might be pushing my luck. The microwave might give away that I was definitely home. The banging continued for another few minutes, becoming less aggressive and more desperate with each round. It went from "open up, we demand it" to "please, let's just talk about this real quick." I watched Gerald check his Rolex twice, probably calculating how much of his precious time was being wasted on this endeavor, and saw Derek try the doorknob like maybe I'd forgotten to lock it and he could just waltz right in. Spoiler alert, I hadn't forgotten. I'd actually double-locked it, because paranoia and good decision-making sometimes look the same. Eventually, after what felt like 15 minutes, but was probably closer to 10, I heard Gerald say clearly, "This is ridiculous. Let's go." Derek protested something about he has to come out eventually, but Gerald was already walking away. I watched through the peephole as Derek stood there for a few more seconds, staring at my door like it had personally betrayed him, before finally following his father down the hallway. A minute later, I heard the telltale sound of their SUV, one of those massive luxury tanks that gets approximately 8 miles per gallon and makes backing out of parking spots everyone else's problem, starting up in the parking lot. Then came the aggressive acceleration, tires squealing slightly as they peeled out of the driveway like teenagers who just got rejected at prom. The sound faded into the distance, and suddenly my apartment was quiet again except for the hum of my refrigerator and the upstairs neighbor doing whatever weird cardio routine they did every evening. I stood at the door for another moment, just to make sure they weren't pulling some kind of fake out where they'd wait in the parking lot and rush back when I opened the door. But no, they were really gone. The coast was clear. I was safe in my jellyfish documentary watching sanctuary. I raised my mug toward the door in another solo toast. And that's how you ghost your in-laws without dying first, I announced to my empty living room, feeling absolutely triumphant. But I wasn't done. Oh no, I was just getting started. I walked over to my makeshift home office corner, set my coffee mug down on a coaster, because I'm not an animal, and pulled out my old bank statements from the drawer where I'd stuffed them a few days ago. I grabbed a highlighter from my desk organizer, one of those yellow ones that's so bright it practically glows, and got to work. I started with the most recent statement and worked backward, highlighting every single transaction that had anything to do with Derek or the Parker family. $300 here for emergency car repairs that Derek needed right away. $800 there for temporary business expenses that were definitely not temporary. $1,500 for that time Patricia needed help with her charity event that mysteriously required cash. $2,000 when Derek's revolutionary app was about to tank because apparently prayer and positive thinking alone don't pay supplier invoices. The more I highlighted, the angrier I got. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes you want to throw things, though I was definitely considering throwing my pen across the room at one point, but the cold, calculated kind that makes you really see things clearly for the first time. Each highlighted line represented a time I'd said yes when I should have said no. Each transaction was a moment I'd chosen keeping the peace over keeping my dignity. And all of it, every single dollar, had gone to people who'd spent years treating me like a second-class citizen in their kingdom of casual cruelty. When I was finally done, the papers looked like some kind of abstract art project, bright yellow highlights everywhere, creating patterns that told the story of my financial and emotional exploitation. I spread them out on my desk and just stared at them for a minute, taking in the full scope of what I'd allowed to happen. It was like looking at a map of a country I'd somehow agreed to live in without realizing how terrible the climate was, which smelled like a combination of old carpet and someone's excessive cologne, turning the envelope over in my hands like it might explode. It had weight to it, the kind that suggested something more substantial than a letter or a bill. My first thought was anthrax, which I'll admit was probably overly dramatic, but you never know with rich people who feel wronged. They've got resources and connections and a fundamental belief that consequences don't apply to them. I took the envelope back upstairs, set it on my kitchen counter, and stared at it for a solid 5 minutes while I made myself a sandwich. Turkey and cheese, nothing fancy, because my life had become refreshingly simple since I'd stopped trying to impress people who thought Grey Poupon was a personality trait. The envelope just sat there, taunting me with its mystery. Finally, I grabbed a butter knife, because apparently I was still cautious about potential explosives, and carefully opened it. Inside was cash, $400 in crisp $20 bills, stacked neatly and held together with a paper clip. No note, no explanation. No, sorry we treated you like garbage, or my bad about the whole public humiliation thing. Just money, sitting there like it was supposed to speak for itself. Like $400 could somehow erase years of condescension, manipulation, and that dinner where they'd all laughed at me being excluded from their country club circle of dysfunction. I picked up the stack of bills and fanned them out, half expecting to find some kind of hidden message written on them or maybe a passive-aggressive sticky note. But no, it was just money, cold, impersonal, and completely missing the point. This was their apology. This was them thinking they could buy their way back into my good graces, or more accurately, buy their way back into my bank account. The sheer audacity of it made me laugh, that bitter kind of laugh you do when you realize people are even worse than you thought they were. I walked over to my trash can, the one with the broken foot pedal that I kept meaning to replace, but never did, and just stood there holding the cash. Part of me, the practical part that had been paying bills and eating ramen to help these people, said, "Keep it, idiot. It's $400. That's groceries. That's utility bills. That's at least some return on your $20,000 investment in the worst family ever. But the other part, the part that was finally learning what self-respect felt like, said something different. I dropped the cash into the trash can, right on top of a banana peel and some junk mail. Watched it fall like I was in some kind of indie movie about finding yourself after a divorce. It felt good. It felt right. It felt like the first honest decision I'd made in years. $400 to these people was pocket change, tip money, the amount they probably spend on brunch without thinking twice. It wasn't an apology. It was an insult gift wrapped in Benjamin Franklin's face. That night, I was deep into a cooking show, some British guy yelling at people about risotto, when my phone rang. Unknown number, which I normally don't answer because I have student loans and they're persistent, but something told me to pick up. And sure enough, it was Gerald's voice on the other end, smooth and measured like he was negotiating a business deal instead of calling his son-in-law who he'd helped publicly humiliate less than a week ago. Son, he started, and I immediately wanted to throw my phone across the room. I wasn't his son. I'd never been his son. I was the guy who married his daughter and became a convenient financial resource. Son was what he called me when he wanted something. About the loan, he continued, his voice trailing off like he expected me to jump in and fix everything. But I didn't. I just waited. Let the silence stretch out between us like taffy. Made him actually work for it instead of assuming I'd roll over and make things easy like I always had before. I could practically hear him sweating through the phone, trying to figure out why his usual manipulation tactics weren't landing. Finally, I cut in. Ah, the one your son couldn't pay? Yeah, I got the memo. My voice was cheerful, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. Kill them with kindness, as they say, except the kindness is actually weaponized sarcasm. He sighed. This long, dramatic exhale that sounded like it came from the depths of his soul, or whatever passed for a soul, in people who wore $3,000 suits. Don't take it personally, he said, and I could hear him adjusting in his leather chair, probably in his home office with all his fancy degrees on the wall. It's just business. And there it was. The line that rich people use when they screw you over and want you to pretend it's okay. It's just business. Like that somehow erases the personal element. Like money doesn't represent time and effort and sacrifice. Like I hadn't worked overtime and skipped vacations and lived on a budget so I could fund their just business ventures. I laughed, actually laughed right into the phone, and I could tell it caught him off guard because he went silent. That's the problem, I said, still chuckling. It's always business with your family. Never humanity. Never basic human decency. Just transactions and spreadsheets, and who can manipulate who out of what. I paused, letting that sink in for a second. You sent me $400 in an envelope, like I'm some kind of hitman you need to pay off for keeping quiet. No note, no apology, just cash. You know what that tells me? That you think everything, including respect, dignity, and basic family relationships, can be bought. And honestly, Gerald, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard. There was silence on the other end. I could hear him breathing, probably trying to formulate some response that would make him sound reasonable while still getting what he wanted. But I didn't give him the chance. Here's the thing. I continued on a roll now. I threw that money in the trash, right on top of some really disgusting banana peels. Because that's what I think of your guilt money. That's what I think of this whole it's just business mentality. You can't buy your way out of being terrible people, and you definitely can't buy your way back into my bank account. Now wait, he started, his voice rising slightly, losing that measured corporate calm. No, you wait, I interrupted, feeling more powerful than I had in years. You had your chance. You had multiple chances. You've had years of chances to treat me like a human being instead of a walking wallet. And every single time, you chose to treat me like I was beneath you. So now I'm choosing to treat you like you don't exist. How's that for business? He tried to say something else, probably some variation of, you're being unreasonable, or think about Melissa, but I didn't care. I was done. Done with the manipulation, done with the guilt trips, done with pretending that their version of family meant anything other than exploitation with a side of holiday dinners. Have a great evening, Gerald, I said, my voice dripping with the kind of false politeness that would make a Southern belle proud. And tell Derek that loan payment he's worried about? Yeah, it's not coming. Ever. Enjoy your bankruptcy. Then I hung up, just pressed that red button, and ended the call before he could respond. And you know what? It felt incredible. It felt like finally standing up after years of being pushed down. It felt like the best phone call I'd ever had with the man, which was really saying something about the quality of our previous conversations. I sat there on my couch, phone in hand, heart racing a little bit from the adrenaline of actually standing up for myself. The British chef on TV was still yelling about risotto, completely oblivious to the personal revolution happening in my living room. I looked around my small apartment. The IKEA furniture, the stained carpet I kept meaning to clean, the empty walls that Melissa always complained about, and realized something profound. This place, with all its flaws and budget constraints, was more home than that massive Parker estate had ever been. Because here, I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to be anything other than exactly who I was. And that, I decided, was worth more than all their money and approval combined. I smiled, settled back into my couch, and turned up the volume on the cooking show. Best evening I'd had in weeks. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was anxious or upset or having second thoughts about telling Gerald where he could shove his business philosophy. No, I couldn't sleep because I had this buzzing energy running through my veins like I'd mainlined espresso directly into my bloodstream. I kept thinking about that phone call, replaying it in my head like a highlight reel of personal growth, and every time I got to the part where I hung up on him, I smiled so hard my face hurt. But the smile faded when I realized something important. These people weren't going to learn. They weren't going to have some magical epiphany where they suddenly understood they'd been terrible. Rich people don't work like that. They need receipts. Literal, physical, undeniable receipts. So at 2 in the morning, wearing my oldest pajama pants and a t-shirt with a mysterious stain I'd stopped trying to identify years ago, I sat down at my desk and fired up my laptop. The screen lit up my face in the darkness like some kind of deranged accountant preparing for the audit of the century. Which, in a way, I was. I logged into my online banking, had to reset my password because apparently I hadn't checked it in 3 weeks, which probably said something about my avoidance issues, but whatever, and started the process all over again. But this time was different. This time I wasn't just highlighting for my own records. This time I was building a case file, a portfolio of evidence that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. I went through every single statement from the past 3 years, printing out each page that showed a transfer to Derek, a loan, to the family, or a temporary help payment that was about as temporary as a diamond. My printer, this ancient HP dinosaur that sounded like it was dying every time it printed, wheezed and groaned its way through 47 pages of financial documentation. I spread them all out on my living room floor because my desk wasn't big enough to handle the sheer volume of my stupidity. It looked like a crime scene, except instead of chalk outlines there were bank statements. And instead of evidence of murder, there was evidence of financial homicide. My money's murder, specifically, executed by the Parker family over multiple years with calculated precision. $300 here for Derek's emergency car repair that I later found out was actually him getting custom rims because apparently his business was doing so well he could afford decorative wheels, but not, actual business expenses. $800 there for the time Patricia needed help with her charity gala because the caterer required a deposit and somehow their multiple bank accounts were all temporarily tied up. $1,500 for when Derek's app was failing and he needed to keep the lights on at the office, which I discovered later was actually a WeWork space that cost like $200 a month. $2,000 for the time Melissa's parents needed help with property taxes, even though they owned a house worth more than I'd make in a decade. The list went on. And on, and on. Every transfer had a story, and every story was basically the same. They needed money. I gave it. They never paid it back, and somehow I was supposed to feel grateful for the opportunity to help. It was like being in an abusive relationship, except instead of one person, it was an entire family. And instead of love bombing, they used guilt tripping and social pressure. I grabbed a red pen, because highlighters felt too subtle for this moment, and started circling the amounts. Then I added them up again, double-checking my math from a few days ago, because surely I'd made a mistake. Surely it couldn't actually be $20,000. But nope, the calculator on my phone confirmed it. $20,347 to be exact. The 347 felt especially insulting, like they couldn't even round it up to a nice, even number. They had to squeeze every last penny out of me. I sat there on my living room floor, surrounded by evidence of my own enabling, and felt this weird mix of emotions. Anger, obviously. embarrassment that I'd let it go on for so long, but also this strange sense of clarity, like I was finally seeing the full picture after years of only looking at individual pixels. This wasn't just about Derek being a mooch or Gerald being manipulative. This was a system, a family operation where I was the resource to be extracted and exploited. But here's the thing about finally seeing clearly. It makes you want to help other people see clearly too. Or in this case, make them look at what they've done and feel something. Guilt, shame, recognition, anything. So I gathered up all 47 pages, stacked them neatly like I was preparing a presentation for the world's most dysfunctional board meeting, and packed them into a large brown envelope I'd bought from Office Depot during a lunch break months ago and never used. On the front of the envelope, in my neatest handwriting, the kind I used to use for birthday cards before I realized this family probably threw them away without reading them, I wrote, "This is who I've been. Ask yourselves who you've been." It felt profound in the moment, like something a philosopher would say, or maybe a really deep fortune cookie. Would it actually make them reflect on their behavior? Probably not. Would they just throw it away and call me dramatic? Almost definitely. But that wasn't the point. The point was that I was drawing a line, creating a record, making sure that somewhere in the universe there was documented proof that I had tried, that I had given, and that they had taken until there was nothing left to take. I sealed the envelope, grabbed my keys and wallet, and drove to the post office at 3 in the morning. Yes, they're closed at 3 a.m., but they have those blue mailboxes outside where you can drop stuff off and feel like a spy leaving classified documents in a dead drop. I sat in my car in the empty parking lot, which was weirdly peaceful in that liminal space between night and morning, and stared at the envelope for a minute. Last chance to be petty, I said out loud to myself, because talking to yourself at 3 a.m. in a post office parking lot is totally normal behavior. Once this goes in, there's no taking it back. But did I want to take it back? Hell no. I got out of my car, walked over to the mailbox with purpose, and dropped that envelope in like I was dropping a microphone after the greatest performance of my life. The satisfying thud it made hitting the bottom of the mailbox was better than any applause. I didn't need tracking. I didn't need confirmation. Karma, as they say, has its own GPS, and this package was headed straight to its destination. By evening the next day, my phone rang. Melissa. I stared at her name on my screen. Her contact photo was from our wedding, back when I thought marrying into this family was a good idea and debated not answering. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear this. You sent something to my parents? She asked, skipping right past hello, or how are you, or any of the normal ways humans start conversations. Her voice had that tight quality it got when she was annoyed but trying to sound calm, like a yoga instructor who just found out someone stole her mat. It was the same tone she used when I forgot to take out the trash or when I suggested we spend Christmas at my family's house instead of worshiping at the altar of Parker perfection. Yeah, I said, keeping my voice casual like we were discussing the weather. Proof of generosity. I figured you guys lost the receipts. There was a pause on the other end. I could practically hear her brain working, trying to figure out if I was being serious or sarcastic or both. The answer was both. Definitely both. You didn't have to, she started, but I cut her off. Didn't have to what? Show you exactly how much money I've given your family over the years? Provide documentation of every time I played ATM for people who think I'm not good enough to sit at their table? Yeah, Melissa, I kind of did. Because apparently me just saying it wasn't enough. So now you have it in writing. All 47 pages of it. Silence. The kind of silence that's louder than words. I could hear her breathing, could picture her standing in her childhood bedroom at her parents' house. Because of course she was staying there, surrounded by her high school trophies and her participation ribbons and all the evidence of a life where everything had always been given to her. I don't know what you want me to say, she finally said, her voice smaller now. How about I'm sorry? I suggested. Or thank you for all the money? Or maybe you're right. My family treated you terribly and I should have stood up for you. Any of those would be a good start. More silence. Then, without another word, she hung up. No, love you. No, let's talk about this. No, sorry. Just a click and then dial tone. The universal sound of someone who's done with a conversation but doesn't have the courage to actually end things properly. I looked at my phone, at Melissa's photo still on the screen, and felt nothing. Not heartbreak, not anger, not even disappointment. Just this calm, quiet nothing that felt like the emotional equivalent of a blank page. And honestly, that nothing felt like something. It felt like victory. It tasted like freedom with a hint of justified pettiness. I set my phone down, leaned back on my couch, and smiled at the ceiling. Silent treatment. I said to no one in particular. The universal language of people who know they're wrong but are too proud to admit it. And for the first time in my marriage, I was perfectly okay with the silence. 2 days later, I was at my desk doing actual work for the company that actually paid me. Revolutionary concept, I know, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail because I've got student loans and they're more persistent than a toddler asking why. But I was in that productive zone where answering the phone felt like a legitimate break from spreadsheets. Plus, mystery calls are always either incredibly boring or incredibly interesting. And I was gambling on interesting. Mr. Parker, a professional male voice asked when I picked up. Depends on which Mr. Parker you're looking for, I said, because there were now multiple members of that cursed family I wanted nothing to do with. If you're calling about Derek Parker's terrible life choices, you've got the wrong guy. There was a brief pause, then what sounded like papers shuffling. This is Thomas Reed from Greenlight Legal Services. We're verifying your co-signature on a $10,000 loan for Derek Parker, approved 3 months ago. I froze. My brain did that thing where it takes a screenshot of a moment, so you can replay it later when you're trying to fall asleep and your anxiety wants to remind you of all life's greatest hits. Excuse me, I said, my voice going up about 3 octaves higher than I intended. My what on a what now? Your co-signature, he repeated, like I was hard of hearing instead of hard of believing. We're conducting routine verification calls for loans over $5,000. We just need to confirm it's you and that you understood the terms when you signed. My hand tightened around my phone so hard I'm surprised it didn't crack. Listen, Thomas, I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though internally I was screaming like someone who just discovered a spider in their shoe. I don't know what signature you've got on that paperwork, but it's not mine. Unless I signed it in my sleep, or during a blackout I don't remember having, or while being possessed by a demon who's really bad with money. It's not legitimate. More shuffling of papers. I could hear keyboard clicking in the background, the sound of Thomas probably pulling up whatever fraudulent document Derek had submitted. I see, he said slowly, and his tone shifted from routine verification to, oh crap, we might have a problem. Mr. Parker, are you saying you did not co-sign a personal loan for Derek Parker on July 15th of this year? July 15th, I was at a work conference in Chicago eating mediocre hotel food and sitting through presentations about quarterly projections, I said. I wasn't co-signing anything except my own expense reports, which, by the way, I can prove because I have receipts. Actual receipts. Unlike some people in the Parker family who think documentation is optional. There was a long pause. I could practically hear Thomas's brain recalculating his entire day. Mr. Parker, I'm looking at the signature on file right now, and I have to tell you, there are some inconsistencies. Inconsistencies, I repeated. That's a fancy legal word for this is completely fake, isn't it? I can't make that determination over the phone, Thomas said, going full corporate liability mode. But what I can tell you is that based on this conversation and the discrepancies we're noting, you will not be held liable for this loan. We'll be conducting a full investigation into the matter. He said some other stuff about fraud departments and investigation procedures, but I barely heard him. My brain was too busy processing the absolute audacity of what Derek had done. He didn't just ask me for money. He'd literally forged my signature on a loan document. He'd committed actual, legitimate, go-to-jail-if-caught fraud. Using my name, my credit, my identity. Like I was just some kind of resource he could tap whenever he felt like it. Consequences be damned. After Thomas hung up, with promises to send me documentation and keep me updated, I sat there at my desk staring at my computer screen without actually seeing it. My coworker Janet walked by and asked if I was okay, and I just nodded like a broken bobblehead because I didn't trust myself to speak without either laughing maniacally or screaming. She gave me that concerned look people give you when they think you're having a breakdown but don't want to get involved, then hurried back to her cubicle. I pulled up my contacts and scrolled to a name I'd been hoping I wouldn't need. Rebecca Parson, attorney at law. Ms. Parson was someone I'd met at a work event about a year ago. One of those corporate mixer things where everyone pretends to enjoy warm white wine and stale cheese cubes. She'd given me her card after we'd bonded over our mutual hatred of small talk, and I'd kept it in my wallet as a just-in-case measure. Looks like just-in-case had arrived. I stepped outside to the parking lot, because this wasn't a conversation I wanted my coworkers accidentally overhearing, and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring with a brisk, "Parson Law Office, Rebecca speaking." "Ms. Parson, this is," I started. "The guy from the marketing mixer who made that joke about tax evasion and prison food." She interrupted. "I remember. You said you'd never need a lawyer because you were too boring to commit crimes. What happened?" I laughed despite myself. "Turns out I'm still too boring to commit crimes, but my brother-in-law isn't. He forged my signature on a $10,000 loan." There was a pause, then, "Okay, that's actually interesting. Tell me everything." So I did. Standing in the parking lot of my office building, watching people come and go on their lunch breaks completely oblivious to my personal legal drama, I told her about the dinner, the loans, the block number, the envelope of receipts, and now this, the cherry on top of the dysfunction sundae. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated because I was on a roll and didn't want to lose momentum. When I finished, she let out a low whistle. "Well," she said, "this isn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. This is identity fraud. Straight up, no ambiguity, textbook fraud. And the good news is, we can handle it." "Handle it how?" I asked. "Because I'm thinking public humiliation, but I'm guessing you're going to suggest something more legal." She laughed, this sharp, amused sound that made me instantly glad she was on my side. Miss Parson had the personality of a courtroom sniper, the kind of lawyer who smiled while destroying your entire case. "Oh, we can do public humiliation," she said. "We just do it with legal documents. Much more satisfying, I promise. And permanent." We talked for another 15 minutes about cease and desist letters, fraud investigations, and the beautiful world of legal consequences for people who think rules don't apply to them. By the time we hung up, I had an appointment scheduled for the next day and a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, this was all going to work out. I walked back into the office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Janet gave me another concerned look as I passed her cubicle, and this time I just smiled and said, "Everything's great, Janet. I just found out my brother-in-law is a criminal. Best news I've had all year." Her eyes went wide, but I was already back at my desk, pulling up my calendar to block off time for tomorrow's lawyer meeting. I sent Ms. Parson a follow-up email with all the documentation I had, bank statements, the loan verification call details, everything, and felt that familiar buzz of satisfaction that comes from taking action instead of just accepting garbage. That evening, I drove over to see Grandma Rose. She was my late mother's sister, pushing 75, but with more energy and sass than most people half her age. She lived in a small house about 20 minutes away, the kind of place that always smelled like fresh cookies and had doilies on every surface because apparently that's a requirement for being a grandmother. She was also the only relative in my entire extended family circle who had ever treated me like an actual human being instead of a disappointment or an ATM. She opened the door before I even knocked. She had this weird sixth sense about visitors and looked me up and down with those sharp blue eyes that saw everything. "Finally grew a spine," she said by way of greeting, stepping aside to let me in. "More like rented one from my lawyer," I joked, following her into the kitchen where she was already pouring tea. "Not coffee, tea." Grandma Rose was fancy like that. "Good," she said, setting a mug in front of me without asking if I wanted any. "About time. Sit down and tell me what those vultures did now." So I told her everything. The dinner disaster, the silent treatment, the fake loan signature, all of it. She listened while puttering around her kitchen, occasionally nodding or making disapproving sounds, but never interrupting. When I finished, she sat down across from me, folded her hands on the table like she was about to deliver a verdict, and said something that hit me harder than any legal document could. "They only step on you because you lay flat. Stand up, and they'll call you difficult. But difficult is just another word for self-respect." I sat there holding my tea, letting those words sink in. Best advice I'd ever gotten from someone wearing slippers and a cardigan covered in cat hair. We spent the rest of the evening playing cards and trash-talking my in-laws, and by the time I left, I felt like I'd just attended the world's best therapy session. Driving home, I thought about what Grandma Rose had said. Difficult. Self-respect. Two things the Parker family had spent years trying to convince me were the same, as being unreasonable. But they weren't. Standing up for yourself wasn't difficult. It was necessary. And if that made me the bad guy in their story, well, at least I'd finally get to be a character with a backbone. Ms. Parson worked fast. Like, suspiciously fast. The kind of fast that made me wonder if she had a template for, your family member is a criminal cases just sitting in her files waiting for moments exactly like this. 2 days after our meeting, where she'd taken notes in a leather-bound journal like some kind of legal assassin planning her attack, she called me with an update that made my entire week. The cease and desist letter has been sent, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Certified mail, signature required. They'll get it tomorrow morning at the latest. I was in the middle of microwaving leftover Chinese food because cooking felt like too much effort when your life was imploding in the best possible way, and I actually fist-pumped the air like I'd just won the lottery. My upstairs neighbor was vacuuming at that exact moment, so I'm pretty sure nobody heard me yell yes, but it felt good anyway. What happens now? I asked, stirring my lo mein with a fork because I couldn't find my chopsticks and honestly didn't care enough to look harder. Now we wait, Miss Parsons said. Either they respond through their own lawyer, which would be the smart move, or they try to contact you directly, which would be stupid but not surprising. People who commit fraud aren't usually known for their excellent decision-making skills. She had a point. Derek had literally forged my signature on a legal document and somehow thought that would just work? Like the bank wouldn't verify it? Like I wouldn't find out? The man had the criminal planning skills of a cartoon villain, which would be funny if it wasn't also costing me sleep and sanity. We hung up after she reminded me not to engage with any Parker family members directly. Everything had to go through her now, which felt incredibly satisfying in a I have a professional shield against your nonsense kind of way. I ate my reheated lo mein, scrolled through Netflix for 20 minutes without picking anything, and finally settled on a documentary about World War II because apparently my life needed more conflict. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I almost ignored it, probably just another promotional email about a sale I didn't care about, but something made me check. And there it was, sitting in my inbox like a turd in a punch bowl, an email from Derek. Subject line, really? Body text, you'll regret this. Family sticks together. That was it. 2 sentences. No punctuation errors, surprisingly, which made me think he'd probably had someone else read it first. Maybe Melissa. Maybe his dad. Maybe his business partner who definitely existed and wasn't just another person he'd scammed. The email was sent from his personal account. The one with his full name and some inspirational quote in the signature about success and persistence that felt deeply ironic given his current legal situation. I stared at those 2 sentences for a solid minute, feeling my blood pressure rise and then, weirdly, fall again. Because you know what? This was exactly what Ms. Parson had predicted. The stupid move. The direct contact. The attempt at intimidation that would only make things worse for him legally. It was like watching someone dig their own grave and then complain about the dirt under their fingernails. I hit reply. Ms. Parson would probably yell at me later for engaging, but some moments are too good to pass up, and typed. I'm sticking to the part where I don't go to jail for your crimes. Enjoy your cease and desist letter. It should arrive tomorrow. Or something nice for the mail carrier. Then I added, P.S. Family sticks together? That's rich coming from the guy who told me I wasn't part of the family. Pick a narrative, Derek. You can't have both. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, feeling that rush of satisfaction that comes from having the last word in an argument. Then, because I was apparently on a roll with good decisions, I turned off my phone completely. Not silent mode, not do not disturb, fully off. The screen went black and suddenly my apartment felt quieter, calmer, like I'd just closed a door on a room full of screaming toddlers. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and a jacket because it was getting chilly in the evenings now, and drove over to Grandma Rose's place. I probably should have called first, but Grandma Rose had an open-door policy that extended to family members who weren't completely terrible, which basically meant me and her neighbor's cat that sometimes wandered over. She must have seen my car pull up because the door opened before I even made it up the walkway. She stood there in her doorway wearing purple slippers that looked like fuzzy monsters and a cardigan that had seen better days, probably around 1987. Her white hair was pulled back in a bun, and she had that look on her face, the one that said she already knew why I was there and had opinions ready to deploy. Finally grew a spine. she asked, stepping aside to let me in. More like rented one from my lawyer, I said, which made her laugh. This great cackling sound that made her whole face crinkle up. Her house smelled like it always did, a mixture of lavender, old books, and whatever she'd baked recently. Today it was banana bread, I realized, spotting the loaf cooling on the kitchen counter. Her living room was exactly as I remembered. Floral couch that was probably older than me, doilies on every surface like they were multiplying when nobody looked, and about 15 framed photos of family members in various stages of life. I noticed she'd taken down the one of me and Melissa from our wedding. Good call, Grandma. She poured us both tea without asking if I wanted any. Chamomile, because apparently that's what you drink when your life is a legal drama, and settled into her favorite armchair with the kind of satisfied sigh that comes from sitting in the same spot for 30 years. I took the couch, cradling my mug and trying to figure out where to start. "Those vultures been circling again?" she asked, cutting right to it. So I told her about the forged signature, about Ms. Parson and the cease and desist letter, about Derek's idiotic threatening email that was probably going to end up as evidence in court. She listened without interrupting, occasionally sipping her tea and nodding like she was mentally taking notes for later. When I finished, she set down her mug with a decisive clink and looked at me with those sharp blue eyes that had probably terrified her kids when they were growing up. "You know what your problem was?" she said. "Past tense." I asked hopefully. "Past tense," she confirmed. "Your problem was thinking that keeping the peace meant letting them walk all over you. That being the bigger person meant being the smaller doormat." I laughed because it was so accurate it hurt. "Yeah, I'm getting that now. They only step on you because you lay flat," she continued, warming up to her theme. "Stand up, and they'll call you difficult. They'll call you unreasonable, ungrateful, all sorts of things that basically mean, how dare you have boundaries. But difficult is just another word for self-respect, honey. Don't let them confuse the two." I sat there holding my tea, feeling like I'd just been given the secret password to a club I didn't know existed. Self-respect, boundaries, difficult. Words I'd been taught meant I was being a problem, when really they meant I was solving one. "You want some banana bread?" she asked, already getting up to cut me a slice. "Does it come with more life advice?" I joked. "Always," she said. "The banana bread is just so you don't leave hungry. The advice is free because you're family. Real family, not the Parker kind." We spent the next hour eating banana bread, which was phenomenal, by the way, and playing gin rummy, which Grandma Rose took way too seriously for a casual card game. She won 3 games in a row and accused me of letting her win, which I absolutely was not. The woman was just ruthless at cards. By the time I left, it was dark outside and I felt like I'd been to church, therapy, and a really good restaurant all at once. Grandma Rose walked me to the door, gave me a hug that smelled like lavender and home, and said, "You're doing the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you different." Driving home, I thought about what she'd said. Difficult. Self-respect. Standing up instead of laying flat. The Parker family had spent years conditioning me to believe that being agreeable meant being worthless, that my value came from how much I could give without complaint. But Grandma Rose was right. That wasn't love or family. That was exploitation with holiday dinners attached. I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, turned off my car, and sat there for a minute in the silence. Tomorrow, Derek and Gerald would get their cease and desist letters. Tomorrow, the legal wheels would start turning. Tomorrow, there would probably be angry phone calls and threats and attempts at manipulation. But tonight I had banana bread in a container on my passenger seat, advice from the only family member worth keeping, and the knowledge that I was finally standing up. And if that made me difficult, well, I'd wear that label like a badge of honor. 2 weeks. That's how long it took for the legal system to do its thing, which in lawyer time is apparently lightning speed, but an anxious person waiting for justice time felt like approximately 17 years. Those 2 weeks were weird, like being in the eye of a hurricane where everything is calm, but you know the other side is coming and it's going to be spectacular. I went to work, came home, watched TV, lived my life. Except now I had this underlying current of anticipation running through everything like I was waiting for Christmas morning, except instead of presents, it was legal documents. Ms. Parson had warned me it would take time. Paperwork had to be filed, documents had to be prepared, process servers had to be scheduled. Apparently, you can't just show up at someone's house with legal papers and throw them like newspapers. There's a whole professional system involved, which makes sense, but also feels less dramatic than I'd hoped. I'd been picturing something out of a legal thriller, all dramatic music and slow-motion paper throwing. But reality is usually more mundane than that. During those 2 weeks, I got exactly 3 attempted contacts from the Parker family. First was Melissa, calling from her mom's landline like she was in a witness protection program, asking if we could talk about this like adults. I let it go to voicemail and listened to her message 3 times, mostly because it was fascinating to hear her try to sound reasonable while also completely avoiding the part where her brother committed fraud. She never mentioned the forged signature, never said sorry. Just a lot of, we need to communicate, and this is getting out of hand, like I was the one who'd escalated things by having the audacity to press charges against someone who literally stole my identity. The second contact was an email from Patricia, a 5-paragraph essay about family values and forgiveness that read like it had been copied from a self-help book about conflict resolution. She used phrases like circle of trust and healing journey and moving forward together, which would have been touching if we were talking about an actual misunderstanding and not, a felony. I deleted it without responding, but not before forwarding it to Ms. Parson with the subject line, evidence of delusion. The third contact was the weirdest, a LinkedIn connection request from Gerald. LinkedIn, like we were going to network our way out of a legal situation. I left it pending because the petty part of me enjoyed knowing he could see I hadn't accepted or rejected it, just left him in limbo where he belonged. I spent most of those 2 weeks working, sleeping better than I had in years, and meal prepping like someone who'd finally realized they were worth the effort of cooking decent food. I made actual dinners, pasta dishes, stir-fries, even tried my hand at homemade pizza, which turned out surprisingly edible. It was like I'd been so focused on managing the Parker family chaos that I'd forgotten I was allowed to just exist, do normal person things, enjoy my own company. I also spent a concerning amount of time imagining how the serving would go down. Ms. Parson had mentioned they were trying to time it for maximum impact, which I appreciated because if you're going to legally destroy someone's day, you might as well do it with style. I pictured Derek answering his door in his bathrobe, coffee in hand, getting served before his brain fully woke up. Or Gerald in his office, surrounded by his fancy degrees and expensive furniture, having to accept papers in front of his employees. Every scenario, I imagined, brought me an inappropriate amount of joy. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in the middle of a meeting about marketing strategies that could have been an email, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it, because I'm professional like that, but it buzzed again. And again. By the 4th buzz, my manager Brad was giving me a look that said, "Really?" So I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. 3 texts from Miss Parson. The first one was just, "It's done." The second, "They've been served." The third, "Call me when you can. You're going to love this." I stood in that fluorescent-lit hallway outside Conference Room B, staring at my phone like it had just told me I'd won the lottery, and felt this wave of pure satisfaction wash over me. It was done. The papers were delivered. The legal wheels were officially in motion. After years of being treated like a second-class citizen with a first-class bank account, after months of planning and 2 weeks of waiting, justice had finally shown up in physical form. I called Miss Parson immediately, not even caring that I was technically still in a meeting. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear the amusement in her voice before she even said hello. "So," she started, "you want the basic version or the detailed version?" "Detailed," I said without hesitation. "I want every single glorious detail." She laughed, that sharp, satisfied sound of a lawyer who'd just executed a perfect legal maneuver. They were at the airport, Reagan National, apparently heading to some family event in Martha's Vineyard. My process server said their luggage had tags on it. Oh, this was already better than I'd imagined. They weren't just served at home or at work. They were served at the airport, probably in front of other travelers, possibly in line for security or sitting at some overpriced airport bar. Public, embarrassing, and with witnesses. Chef's kiss. My guy, his name's Marcus, former Marine, takes his job very seriously. He spotted them near the Delta check-in area. Your father-in-law, Derek, and your wife were all there together. Marcus said they were laughing about something. Looked like they didn't have a care in the world. Had being the operative word, I interjected. Exactly. So Marcus walks up in his Navy suit. He always wears Navy, Says it looks official enough to be intimidating, but not so official that people immediately run, and he addresses them by name. Gerald Parker? Derek Parker. They both turn around, probably thinking he's someone they know, or maybe airport security, and Marcus hands each of them a thick manila envelope with your name printed on the tab. I could picture it so clearly it was like watching a movie in my head. The busy airport terminal, announcements echoing overhead about boarding times and unattended luggage, travelers rushing past with their rolling suitcases. And there in the middle of it all, Gerald and Derek getting handed papers that would turn their entire day, possibly their entire year, upside down. What did they do? I asked, probably sounding way too eager. Derek went pale, Ms. Parsons said, and I could hear her grinning through the phone. Like, visibly pale. Marcus said it was like watching someone realize they left the stove on, except worse. He opened the envelope right there, which people usually don't do. They wait until there's somewhere private. And I guess the words fraud investigation and identity theft were visible enough because his hands started shaking. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Years of Derek strutting around like he was God's gift to entrepreneurship, and now he was standing in an airport having a panic attack over legal documents. The universe had a sense of humor after all. Gerald tried to play it cool, she continued. Took his envelope, didn't open it, just kind of held it, and said something to Marcus about not knowing what this is. Marcus, professional that he is, informed him that he'd been served legal notice regarding a fraud investigation and that all the information he needed was in the envelope. Very calm, very official. Didn't engage with any questions. And Melissa? I asked, because I couldn't help myself. Marcus said she just stood there frozen. Like literally frozen, didn't move or speak. Just stared at her dad and her brother holding these envelopes with your name on them. He described her as looking like a bad actress in a legal drama who forgot her lines. I burst out laughing right there in the hallway. A coworker walking by gave me a weird look, but I didn't care. Melissa, always so composed, always so ready with the perfect response for her parents, just standing there with nothing to say. For once in her life, she couldn't smooth things over or redirect attention or make excuses. She just had to stand there and watch her family face actual consequences. Marcus said they missed their flight, Miss Parson added. After he left, he saw them still standing there arguing. Apparently, Gerald wanted to go through security and deal with it later, but Derek was having a full meltdown. Your wife was on her phone, probably calling every lawyer she could think of. This is the best money I've ever spent on legal fees, I said, meaning every word. Oh, we're not done yet, Ms. Parsons said cheerfully. This is just the service of papers. Discovery is going to be fun. Financial records, depositions, the whole 9 yards. They're going to have to answer questions under oath about every loan, every transfer, every forged signature. It's going to get real uncomfortable real fast. We talked for a few more minutes about next steps and timeline, but honestly, I barely heard her. I was too busy replaying the airport scene in my head, adding details and imagining expressions. Derek's panic. Gerald's attempt at control failing spectacularly. Melissa frozen like a computer that crashed. It was poetry. It was justice with a side of public humiliation. It was everything I didn't know I needed. When I hung up, I stood in that hallway for another minute, just savoring the moment. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been me doing something petty and ultimately meaningless. This was justice, delivered by a professional in a Navy suit, backed by legal documents and the full weight of the law. This was consequences finding people who'd spent their whole lives avoiding them. I went back into the meeting, apologized for the interruption, and spent the rest of the hour with a smile on my face that probably made me look slightly unhinged. Brad asked if everything was okay, and I just nodded and said, "Everything's perfect. Just got some really good news." And it was. It really, truly was. The next few weeks were absolutely glorious, and I mean that in the most petty, satisfying way possible. It was like watching dominoes fall, except instead of dominoes, it was the carefully constructed empire of lies the Parker family had built, and instead of feeling bad about it, I felt like throwing a parade. Ms. Parson kept me updated with regular emails that read like chapters from the world's most satisfying legal thriller, each one better than the last. Derek's fake loan got voided within the first week. The bank's fraud department moved faster than I expected. Apparently, they don't appreciate when people forge signatures on $10,000 loans because it makes them look bad and potentially liable. Who knew? Derek's accounts got frozen while they investigated, which meant his booming business suddenly had no access to funds. MS. Parsons sent me a copy of the bank's letter to Derek, and I'm not ashamed to admit I printed it out and hung it on my fridge like a child's straight-A report card. It was that beautiful. But the real poetry came when I found out about Gerald's credit score. Turns out when you co-sign fraudulent loans and your family members' accounts get investigated for fraud, the financial institutions start looking at everyone involved. Gerald's pristine credit, the kind that gets you premium cards and exclusive investment opportunities, took a nosedive faster than the stock market in 2008. Miss Parson heard through the legal grapevine that he'd been denied for some commercial property loan he was trying to secure. If I'd known Schadenfreude could feel this good, I would have stood up for myself years ago. The calls started coming after the second week. First up was Melissa, naturally, because apparently I was still her go-to person when things went wrong even though she'd spent months treating me like optional furniture. Her number popped up on my screen while I was grocery shopping, finally buying the name-brand cereal instead of the cardboard-flavored generic stuff I'd been eating to save money for family emergencies. "You didn't have to go that far," she said the second I answered, skipping any pretense of pleasantries. I stood there in aisle 7, holding a box of actual Frosted Flakes, and laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-on laugh that made an elderly woman shopping near me look concerned. "Didn't I?" I said. "He forged my name, Melissa. That's identity theft. That's a crime." What exactly was the appropriate response? A stern talking to? A disappointed head shake? "He's family," she said, her voice doing that thing where it got tight and defensive. "No, he's your family," I corrected. "He made it very clear I'm not part of that club. Remember? The dinner? The laughing? Any of this ringing a bell?" She hung up without another word. I added the Frosted Flakes to my cart and moved on to the ice cream section, feeling lighter with every step. 3 days later, Patricia called. I was half expecting it. The woman had a pattern of swooping in to smooth things over when her family's chaos got too messy. She used her reasonable adult voice, the one that made you feel like you were being difficult for having feelings or boundaries or basic self-respect. "Can we move past this?" she asked, like we were discussing a minor disagreement about dinner plans instead of fraud and years of financial exploitation. "Sure," I said cheerfully. I was making dinner, actual dinner with vegetables and everything, and I wasn't about to let her ruin my evening. "You first. Try moving past my lawyer's letter. Try moving past the fraud investigation. Try moving past the part where your family treated me like a human ATM for years and then laughed when I finally said no." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, probably trying to formulate some response that would make me the unreasonable one. But before she could speak, I added, "Oh, and Patricia, lose my number. We're done here." Then I hung up, stirred my pasta, and smiled at my reflection in the microwave door. Growth looks good on me, I thought. They stopped calling after that. No more texts, no more emails, no more LinkedIn connection requests from Gerald that sat in pending limbo. Just blessed, beautiful silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full of possibility and peace and the absence of people who only valued me for my bank account. I started sleeping like a baby, and not the kind of baby that wakes up crying every 2 hours. The kind from commercials who sleeps peacefully through the night because their needs are met and nobody's taking advantage of them. For years, I'd been lying awake worried about the next Parker family emergency, the next loan request, the next dinner where I'd be the punchline. Now I slept straight through until my alarm, dreaming about absolutely nothing because my subconscious finally had nothing to process. One night, about 3 weeks into my new drama-free existence, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd checked my bank account with anxiety. I used to log in daily, sometimes multiple times, making sure there was enough to cover whatever crisis the Parkers had manufactured. Now I checked it once a week, casually, like a normal person who wasn't funding an entire family's bad decisions. I was finally free. Free from being their backup plan, their emergency fund, their emotional punching bag with a debit card. And the best part? I didn't miss them. Not even a little bit. Turns out when people only contact you when they need something, their absence feels less like loss and more like liberation. I raised my glass of wine, the $12 bottle instead of the $6 one, because I was celebrating, to my empty apartment, and said what I'd been thinking for weeks. "Here's to sleeping well and not paying for other people's adult daycare anymore. Best toast I ever made. Weeks later, I found myself sitting on my balcony, this tiny concrete slab that the apartment complex generously called outdoor living space, drinking a $10 bottle of wine that tasted like freedom mixed with slightly questionable grapes. It was one of those perfect autumn evenings where the air was cool enough to need a light jacket, but not cold enough to actually go inside. The sun was setting, painting the sky in those Instagram filter colors that people never believe are real, and I was just existing. No drama, no crisis, no family emergency requiring my immediate financial intervention. Just me, my questionable wine, and the sound of my neighbor's TV playing Wheel of Fortune through the wall. Melissa had officially moved back in with her parents about 2 weeks ago. She'd sent me a text, not even a call, just a text, saying she needed space to think and was staying at her childhood home, temporarily. I'd responded with a thumbs up emoji, which probably wasn't the mature response she was hoping for, but honestly, it was more effort than the situation deserved. We both knew temporarily was code for indefinitely or possibly forever, and neither of us had the energy to pretend otherwise. The thing about Melissa leaving was that it didn't hurt the way I thought it would. I kept waiting for this wave of sadness or regret to hit me, some moment where I'd realize I'd made a terrible mistake and needed to fix everything. But it never came. Instead, I felt this weird lightness, like someone had removed a backpack I'd been wearing for so long I forgot it was there. Turns out when someone shows you who they are, and their family shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time. Would have saved me a lot of money and therapy if I'd figured that out earlier. I heard through the grapevine, specifically through Grandma Rose, who had sources everywhere like some kind of elderly intelligence network, that the Parker family reunion went ahead as planned. Martha's Vineyard, fancy rental house, probably salmon and champagne, and conversations about stock portfolios. They even kept my seat empty at the dinner table, which Grandma Rose found hilarious and I found oddly touching in a twisted way. Like a memorial for someone who was still alive but had simply chosen to exist elsewhere. They kept asking where you were. Grandma Rose had told me over the phone, cackling like she'd just heard the world's best joke. Patricia kept saying you were dealing with some things like you were in rehab instead of just done with their nonsense. Good, I thought. Let it stay empty. Let them look at that vacant chair and think about all the dinners where they'd made me feel invisible while physically present. Let them wonder if maybe, just maybe, they'd pushed too far. Though knowing them, they probably just used it as extra space for Patricia's purse. I took another sip of my wine and thought about how my definition of peace had changed. For years, I'd thought peace meant getting along, avoiding conflict, being the person who smoothed things over and kept everyone happy. I'd thought that being the bigger person meant absorbing everyone else's garbage with a smile and never complaining. That keeping the family together meant sacrificing myself piece by piece until there was nothing left. But now I knew better. Peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the absence of people who created unnecessary conflict. It wasn't about keeping toxic people happy. It was about keeping toxic people away. Real peace, I discovered, was walking away from people who didn't value you and somehow still wishing them well from a safe, legally protected distance. My phone buzzed with a text from Ms. Parson. Derek's fraud case moving forward. Discovery starts next month. You still good? I typed back. Never better. Let me know if you need anything. She responded with a professional thumbs up, and I smiled. The legal process was slow but thorough, and for once in my life, I didn't mind waiting. Justice doesn't have to be fast to be satisfying. I leaned back in my cheap plastic patio chair, the kind you buy from Target for $20 and pretend is comfortable, and raised my wine glass to the empty evening sky. The streetlights were starting to flicker on. My neighbor had moved from Wheel of Fortune to Jeopardy, and somewhere in Martha's Vineyard my former in-laws were probably toasting to family values they didn't actually possess. Here's to family, I said out loud to nobody in particular, the only investment that never yields returns. And then I laughed. Really laughed. Not the bitter, angry kind, but the genuine, from the gut kind that makes your eyes water and your chest hurt in a good way. Because for the first time in years, maybe ever, I wasn't part of their family, and that was finally, absolutely, beautifully the best news I'd ever heard. I wasn't their ATM anymore. I wasn't their backup plan or their emergency fund or their punchline. I was just me, sitting on a balcony with cheap wine, discovering that being alone was infinitely better than being with people who made me feel alone anyway. The wine was terrible, the chair was uncomfortable, and my apartment was about a quarter the size of the Parker estate. But you know what? It was mine. My space, my rules, my peace. And that made it worth more than all their money and approval combined. I finished my glass, watched the last colors fade from the sky, and went inside to start planning my actual future, the one where I spent my money on myself, made decisions without committee approval, and lived my life on my terms. Turned out walking away wasn't the end of my story. It was finally the beginning.